When I taught constitutional legal history at universities, I used to start with a lecture which was a quiz. And I'd say, who was Lachlan Macquarie? And a group of 100 kids, there would be 4 who would know.
This is a great opportunity to plug a wonderful book that we're launching today. It's called The Menzies Watershed, Liberalism, Anti-communism, Continuities, 1943 to 1954. It's published by the Melbourne University Press. It's one of 4 books. This is the second part of a four-part series on the Menzies government, or Robert Menzies and the Menzies government. And it's produced by our friends at the Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. There are so many great stories to talk about Menzies. I mean, you could talk about this period that we're going to discuss tonight from 43 to 54. But without going into great detail, in my case, as someone who prizes great public speakers, Menzies was an outstanding public speaker, and he was very quick on the rebound. And there are so many funny stories about Menzies. When he'd speak at rallies, he'd often face a backlash from some riffraff in the audience. And one time, some character yelled out, "Tell us what you know, Menzies. It won't take long." To which Menzies replied, "I tell you what we both know, and it won't take any longer." And at one other point that's been documented, I mean, can you imagine today's politicians being so quick? He was something special, wasn't he? Yeah. And there was another example I love when he was talking and some lady interrupted him saying, Menzies, even if you were the Archangel Gabriel, I would not vote for you. To which he replied quickly, "Madam, if you were the Archangel Gabriel, you would not be in my electorate." I mean, there are so many great stories like this about Menzies. A fascinating figure, and it's a great credit to the Georgina Downer who runs the Robert Menzies Institute. It's a great credit to them to talk about Menzies and his role in history. Please welcome my friend and colleague, Georgina Downer.
A huge thank you to Tom and CIS for hosting tonight. Tom has been a great supporter of the Robert Menzies Institute and has supported 3 events of ours, which has been fantastic because we don't have a base here in Sydney. We're based in Melbourne. For those of you who are new to us, we're Australia's 6th Prime Ministerial Library Museum. We're really modelled off those US presidential libraries, and we are committed to honouring the life and legacy of Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, Robert Gordon Menzies. We're based at the University of Melbourne. If you're familiar with the university, we're in the old quadrangle. If you're not familiar with the university, we're in the absolute most beautiful, best part of the university. It's modelled on those Oxbridge cloisters, and we have a whole wing there where we have a fabulous museum which has 2 exhibitions a year that exhibit items on display from the Menzies collection. And the Menzies collection is owned by the University of Melbourne. It is about 4,500 books that formed Robert Menzies' personal library that he donated to the university just before his death. And there are items like gifts from Winston Churchill, from Franklin D. Roosevelt, from Felix Frankfurter for the constitutional lawyers. You'll appreciate that. Intimate gifts from family members, books that he purchased himself as a young person, poetry, literature, through to political books from the left and the right. He was not ideologically one-sided in his reading. He read broadly, and you can understand the level of thought and reading that he put into his speeches, which became such an important part of the telling of modern Australia, the story of modern Australia through the 40s, 50s and 60s. We're also busy not just exhibiting items from the Menzies collection through our research program, and of course tonight's book is a product of that. We have a annual conference series, and after each conference we produce these wonderful books with Melbourne University Press. We have a vibrant events program, and of course tonight we're very kindly helped by CIS. It's wonderful to be here, but we run regular lectures, really trying to engage the public on Menzies ideas and history. This has been a great honour to run the Robert Menzies Institute for the last 3 years, only 3 years of its existence. It's been a great honour to do this on a university campus where a lot of statues are torn down. We're erecting one in this institute. So it's really quite a unique place to be, and I feel very privileged to have the job of leading this. I am really excited about this second book. It's, as Tom said, been ably edited by our in-house historian, Dr. Zachary Gorman. And tonight's launch is the fourth of our launches that we had around Australia. We had Melbourne late last year. We were supposed to have Sydney in early November last year, but I don't know if you recall, DP World, the port operators, they had a cyber attack, and unfortunately all our books got stuck at the port. So Greg very kindly has put off the launch until tonight for us, and his forbearance is very, very grateful for. But this is, yes, as I said, the fourth launch. We've had a launch in Melbourne with Dan Tian. We've had a launch in Canberra with Andrew Hastie, and in Brisbane with George Brandis. It's absolutely wonderful to have Professor Greg Craven tonight to launch this book. Until I'm sure he is extremely familiar to all of you, and I totally endorse Tom's encouragement to you all to read his columns. They are hilarious. The one he just wrote on climate change, I think a couple of days ago, I was in tears reading it. It was so funny. And Cavoodles, oh, that was legendary. Yes. Don't approach Greg if you own one. He doesn't like them, let's just say. He was until 2021 the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University. He's had an incredibly impressive academic career in public law, constitutional law and history, and he's also a leading Catholic layperson. He has, through his career, been a leading voice for constitutional change, particularly in the referendum campaigns for the Republic in '99 and last year for The Voice. And while he has parted company with Robert Menzies, I would suggest on the Republic, he does have a lot in common with Robert Menzies, as I have discovered. They both studied law at Melbourne University. They both have had careers in constitutional law, and Menzies was cut short, of course, because he went into politics, but he made his name first known with the Engineers case. If you're a constitutional lawyer, you'll know that one. They are both mad keen Carlton supporters and cricket tragics. So I am very much looking forward to hearing Greg's reflections on what I think is a fabulous book, and very, very grateful for him to making his way across to the CBD tonight. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. I found my wife in the Melbourne Law Quadrangle, although it was not a museum then, so it was a little different. I know with these things that the very first thing you've got to do is prove that you've read the book. Although I have seen books launch where the person hasn't read the book, and they've tended to go quite well. So there are three ways you can prove you've read a book. The traditional one is to find a typo, which the publisher decently does. This courtesy has not been extended to me, for which I'm very bitter. You can bring in your marked up copy of the book, but of course that could be fraudulent, but I have got it here to be inspected. Or you can randomly attack one of the very good essays, which shows a level of commitment that couldn't be faked. So, Tom, yours was rubbish. I don't know how many monkeys you had hitting typewriters, but clearly some of them were Tasmanian. And then, having proved you've read the book, you can then go on and any way address your own favourite topics, regardless of whether they're in the book, which I will do. As I was saying to Tom and Georgina, I do have some weird personal connection with Sir Robert Menzies. I can remember that my first political conversation, which I've worked out must have been before I was 8, was with Frankie Gattiner, and we agreed that Menzies was a good person because he would save us from the communists, which was probably right, and it does sort of show how personal that stuff about communists was. And I'll come back to that in talking about Menzies. The second thing was, yes, I am a Carlton supporter, and every game you would see Sir Robert Menzies wheeled in his car onto a scaffolded platform where he could watch the game. And the remarkable thing, as my mother pointed out, was that the entire crowd would cheer and clap. And as she said, not more than half of those can actually vote for him. So this shows a proper sense of reality and proportion in an Australian football crowd. And the third was that my father was a journalist. And before he managed to get into the area of journalism, which he desperately wanted to, which was sports journalism, he was stuck with doing things like politics. And he did interview Menzies on a number of occasions, which was always a pretty bad occasion because he worked for evil Ezra Norton. So his questions were always the nastiest. And he recalled that Menzies would just stare at him silently with the most unpleasant expression. And my father's diagnosis was that he was an arrogant bastard, which actually didn't hurt Menzies politically because his diagnosis of Evatt was that he was a pig of a man. And that phrase of a man in the Irish idiom is actually the same as Hillary Clinton's deplorables, that Evatt's soul was piggish. Now, I know, one of the themes of this book is whether Menzies was the man of the man or the man of the moment. I've always been one of those sort of historical twiddlers on these things. It always seems to me it's a little bit of both. Menzies certainly was able to take the moment, and if not make it his own, then make it his moment. And I actually think it was more than just the internal things about post-war reconstruction. I think one of Menzies' greatest parts of the moment, in fact, was that one that I was talking about to Frankie Gatner, which was about communism. That at a time of world crisis, Menzies stood on the right side and articulately on that crisis. Whenever I see the forgotten people, I think most people put the emphasis on the forgotten. I tend to put it on the people. That the thing that Menzies did was he carried on the idea that people were in fact people rather than just numbers, and that was quite contrary to the opposite position of the world. And I think that that gift was something that carried Menzies forward into the minds of millions and millions of Australians who were either converted or confirmed in practical liberalism. And there was an amazing range of people who went with Menzies in defiance of probably all their practical political instincts. I remember particularly my father, the journalist, who if you asked him what his politics were, he would say with no sense of irony or humour, I am a democratic socialist who votes Liberal, because he was a ferocious anti-communism, communist, and Menzies was the person who was going to defend his tradition from that disaster. And I think one of the things that emerges from the book and is corresponding to that is the coverage that Menzies managed. One of Menzies' great capacities was really to cover the broad range of the centre-right in a way that really does not happen today. And it's something that really strikes me. Obviously, with Menzies, he managed to combine Liberals and Conservatives. When I had to write a chapter on the Constitution in Tony Staley's History of the Liberal Party, I was writing Conservatives and then I'd write Liberals. In the end, I gave up and I started referring to Liberal Conservatives, which is the centre-right tradition in Australia. Menzies was perfectly placed for that sort of pan-positioning, as this book very well shows. I mean, it describes him as a deaconite liberal. I've always thought I was sort of the last of the deaconite liberals. We're going sadly extinct, I have to say. But the interesting thing about that type of politics was that it believed not only in freedom of enterprise, but freedom to enterprise. And this is partly why so much of the Chifley program, I think, was congenial to Menzies, that it could be used as a way of equalising opportunity to enterprise, to base enterprise. And I think that was something Menzies got fundamentally right, and it allowed him to steal or appropriate those constructive aspects of post-war Labor. And I think that's a major point for the modern day, because I think one of the great difficulties is that in Menzies' day, and he managed to promote this, you really didn't have diametrically separated groups of Liberals and Conservatives. I am a Liberal, you're a Conservative, I hate you. You're actually in a party that had both, not only both, but everybody was both. Everybody was a bit Liberal and a bit Conservative, and I had that in common with you, and that's fine. And now we've degenerated into a party of moderates and Conservatives who do not admit to any commonality whatsoever. It strikes me as that is fundamentally anti-Menzies. It's the destruction of Menzies' political tradition. And the truth is, until that's resolved, until you can walk into a room and say, I agree with this, don't agree, but by God, I agree with you on that, you're not actually going to have an effective centre-right in this country. You're not going to have an effective party of the centre-right. And I think there we have to learn from Menzies. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the book is putting Menzies in the Whig tradition, which I think is complicated. Menzies certainly believed in what I've always called the British constitutional genius, that through the 19th century, a form of government was developed that was, if not the best possible ever in the world, was certainly the best possible going, and would eventually develop, no matter what happened, into the best in the world. I agree with that. Sometimes people said, well, you're just a Whig. I would say that Menzies' Whiggism was not necessarily the only type and was sometimes complicated. I was very interested to see Menzies liked Cromwell. I detest Cromwell, not just because of my Irish background, and Cromwell was not well loved in Ireland, but frankly because I'm much more of a monarchist legitimist than Menzies is. My view is you can't execute kings, you can only murder them. So it's very odd that Menzies, as a monarchist, rather went there. When I was Crown Counsel in Victoria, we had a house style for Cromwell. We never referred to him as the Lord Protector. We merely referred to him correctly as the usurper Cromwell. So I think Menzies was odd on that. The other thing, of course, you have to remember, there is that Irish Whiggism tradition. Burke was not English. Burke was Irish. He was educated in a Catholic hedge school. And so I think Menzies' sort of understanding that was, in one sense, unidimensional. Reminds me of the occasion when Cheryl Saunders, years ago, wanted to have a celebration for the 300th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution. And I did point out to her that the Glorious Revolution was not an occasion of unalloyed joy for some Australians, like myself, of Catholic descent, who was sort of excluded from that type of thing. And the interesting thing was not whether I was right or wrong, but the complete blank incomprehension with which I was met. So the Whig tradition, I think, is more various than one might think. The piece on Santa Maria, the movement at Menzies, is I think, truly fascinating, including there's a suggestion there which probably could be teased out more, that there was a difference in the base of anti-communism between Menzies and Santa Maria. I think that's absolutely true. Menzies was a common lawyer, and therefore his idea of freedom was in a sense deduced from a whole pattern of immunities and exposures created by the common law and statute. It was not a shining light, but it was a magnificent patchwork. Santa Maria, as a Catholic, had a rather different view. He was working on an idea of Catholic anthropology, which was much more open to the idea of a transcendent right of conscience. And it does strike me that there are real echoes of that in today's discussions. So, for example, parts of what you might call the centre-right who supported The Voice, which is a joy I will carry to my grave, really were often Catholic and to some extent Jewish. And I think part of their view of this was in fact also based on that idea of a transcendent right. I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong, although obviously they were right because that was the side that I was on. But it is a difference, I think, in the way that one sees it. I would actually sound a note of caution. In the reaction to the failure of the referendum, it worries me that the Dutton opposition is starting to see the rejection almost in the same way, that it wasn't just a particular transaction, which from their point of view they rightly won, but something of a permanent metaphysical guide to the nature of the Australian political universe, which, if copied in everything else, will necessarily lead to success. I don't think Menzies would necessarily have gone for that either. I thought there was some odd gaps, but they were really gaps of Menzies himself. For example, federalism. Now, Menzies allegedly was a great federalist, and yet he was the Commonwealth's counsel in the engineers case, and yet he did as much to build up the apparatus of the state, of the Commonwealth, as anybody else, and yet ironically remarked to Santa Maria towards the end of his life that his greatest mistake was the building up of Canberra as a so-called national capital. And why did he make that mistake? I have a theory for that. Just as Menzies' Whiggism saw political achievement as historically ascending into the magnificent final embodiment of Westminster, he actually had a somewhat similar and not atypical view of political power, that the natural course of reality was towards the magnificent, omnicompetent, if necessary, omni-crushing central parliament at Westminster. And I suspect almost instinctively cleave to a similar model for Australia. I have my sympathies for him because when I was a little boy, I was bred on books with titles like Kings and Things, adored Richard the Lionheart and Edward III, the First, the Hammer of the Scots. Wasn't until I was about 15 as an Irish Australian that I suddenly realised that the objects of these glory were in fact my Celtic ancestors. I'm not sure Sir Menzies ever actually put the Menzies clan entirely into this thing, but I think that's partly what was happening. So I think the thing that I really got from this volume, which as I say I really did read, was the immense sophistication of Menzies as a mind and a compendium of history directed by that mind, and the fact that his posterity has been really pretty much destroyed. I mean, Labor is so much better at celebrating history than Conservatives in this country. We all know that. Everybody's a hero. Even the execrable, the pig of a man, Doc Evatt, is a hero. We don't even talk about the fact that he was stark raving mad. So it's an interesting question, isn't it? Why is Menzies remembered as a sort of cantankerous beanbag of history? That's really his position. It's quite similar to the Founding Fathers. I won't bore you with my theories on the Founding Fathers. That magnificent set of 19th century polymaths who are virtually forgotten. And I hate to say this, and there are other prime ministerial libraries, and one is the Howard Library, which is at the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra, upon whose board I sit. And I would be very surprised if the historical reputation of John Howard does not go the same way.
It's great to be back here at CIS, and I thank Tom for hosting us. He actually hosted the launch of my first book, Sir Joseph Carruthers, some 6 years ago when I was just a newly graduated PhD, and it was great to have that support. Back then, we had the then New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, do the launch, and I'm still convinced that reading about Carruthers and particularly reading about the great American social theorist Henry George was what got Perrottet obsessed with the idea of a land tax. So for better or worse, I'm taking some credit for that. Menzies, of course, was not a Georgite because the Georgites were all very vehement free traders. And as is explained in this book, Menzies is not someone you can just transport into the modern day and project sort of liberal opinions from 2024 onto and expect him to have held them. He was a protectionist, but I will sort of disagree with Greg on the idea that Menzies was necessarily a deaconite because he was a protectionist. I know it's actually in Tom's chapter, the description of Menzies as a deaconite, but Menzies' political mentor was actually his uncle, Sidney Sampson, who was a federal MP from 1906. And when he was in the federal parliament at that time, when you had that split between George Reed's Free Traders and the Deaconites, he actually sat in what was the third centre-right party called the corner party, which was those protectionists who were also vehemently anti-socialist. They were essentially the successors to the Reid-Maclean government. The Maclean side was the protectionist, but Alan Maclean lost his seat at the 1906 election. And I've always thought that's a perfect metaphor for Menzies as someone who sort of embodies all the different strands of Australia's centre-right. And I think that's a really core theme that came up in Greg's speech, that Menzies is sort of a bunch of what appear at the first glance to be a contradiction. He's a liberal and he's a conservative. He's a federalist, but perhaps in practice he's not. And we've actually got a chapter coming up in volume 3 covering that, which is the great thing about 4 volumes, releasing them every year. You get the criticism of what you missed out, so you can make sure that you don't miss out the next time. And I think that this book sort of really focuses on one of the inherent sort of overlapping contradictions, or two things being true at the same time of Menzies. And one is that this period from 1943 until 1954 was a watershed. It was one of the greatest political watersheds in Australian political history, something that fundamentally shaped what Australia was going to be like in the 20th century and up until today. It's obviously bank nationalisation that's the big ticket one that everyone always thinks of. And it's great to have Anne Henderson here in the audience, who contributes an absolutely stellar chapter on that core issue. But bank nationalisation is essentially just the tip of the Chifley iceberg when it comes to the level of socialism that he was trying to implement. It wasn't just bank nationalisation, it was nationalisation of the airways. It was an attempt to create a government-only healthcare system, which is covered in David First Roberts' chapter in volume 3. He's also got a wonderful chapter in this book. But above all, it was home ownership, this battle over whether Australians should own their own homes, because famously, the Minister for Reconstruction in the Chifley government, John Dedman, said that the Labor Party had no interest in fostering private home ownership, because that would be to turn Australians into little capitalists, and he didn't want that. They had a Commonwealth state housing agreement that was exclusively about building rental properties, that everyone in Australia would rent their property directly from the government, essentially. Certainly that would be the only type of housing that the government would offer any assistance for. But instead, Menzies comes in 1949, he renegotiates the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, puts this real big emphasis on home ownership, which shoots up from 53% in the 1947 census to over 70% in the 1966 census, really shaping and fundamentally forming that property-owning democracy that Australia has been ever since, though one which is obviously very much under threat at the moment. But at the same time, Menzies is also the person who doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He is not a Campbell Newman by any stretch. He appreciates the value of stability. He appreciates that there are things that a Labor government can do and has done that are still fundamentally worth keeping. And a lot of them were actually things that he signposted in his first stint as Prime Minister. So, for example, Keynesian economics and full employment. Well, it was actually the Menzies wartime government which had the first Keynesian budgets in Australian political history. The great wave of post-war migration, that was something that Menzies vehemently advocated for in his Forgotten People radio broadcasts, even before it was adopted as Labor policy. So these are not necessarily Labor ideas, but he's not going to be this person who has to tear everything down. He's going to be constructive, and he's going to be a gradualist in how he constructs things. And probably the greatest testament to that gradualism and testament to how this period is such a watershed is that in the 1940s, you have the 1949 election, which is this fiercely ideological election in this battle over socialism. Yet by the 1960s, when Menzies is retiring, people are talking about the end of ideology, that these debates are essentially over. And that's one of the reasons factionalism only rears its head after Menzies is gone, because people weren't fundamentally debating things anymore, certainly when it came to a lot of things to do with economic policy, because everything seemed to be working so much. And probably his greatest impact in how he reshaped the political debate in Australia was that he transformed the Labor Party. That's probably one of his greatest successes, is that in the 1940s, the Labor Party was explicitly socialist. By the 1960s and certainly into the early 1970s, you had over 70% of Australia owning their own homes. You were not going to get elected as a government if you appealed purely to sort of working class warfare type old school Labor politics. Instead, you had to appeal to the middle class because Australia was overwhelmingly middle class. And for better or worse, Gough Whitlam actually did that. He transformed the Labor Party and made it into the primarily middle class and even upper middle class party that it is today. So thank you.
When I started promoting this event on LinkedIn, which I don't do much of, I did promote this particular event, and I was quite struck by a comment from someone in the public, and I thought I'd just put this to you, Greg. Can I suggest, Tom Switzer, that this constant harking back to Menzies is counterproductive these days? The 1940s and 50s, that Australia is way different to 2024, and there are new forces at play culturally, socially, politically, and economically that require some fresher thinking from the more conservative political leanings in Australia. The Centre for Independent Studies is in danger of losing its relevance. How would you respond to that criticism?
I think it's rarely a danger to look back on history. I think by and large the problem is ignoring history and therefore, in fact, living entirely in the moment of whatever it is that we think is so important. And I think one of the things that book does is it shows just how enduring some of the themes that Menzies was dealing with are, not only politically but psychologically. That idea that everything is now as it always has been, as it always will be, and we live in the moment. And particularly the point that I think we were all making, that Menzies really did understand. I mean, broad church is a sort of a silly term, but he really did understand that you actually had to put together a meeting not necessarily of like but not unlike minds. And every time you look at what we call the centre-right today, I think you see a fundamental failure to do that. So no, I would be looking back to Menzies and to a number of other people.
Yeah. And of course, the Labor Party go to great lengths, quite understandably, to praise their heroes, Curtin, Whitlam, Chifley. The Liberal Party has been criticised for not doing enough of that. Georgina, another criticism that was made about this particular event, that the right establishment in this country focuses on the very things that are cringeworthy that made Menzies: the imperial loyalty, the devotion to monarchy, the grovelling dependence on the US for security, the cultural cringe. Sometimes it seems that the Liberal Party establishment has a death wish that they are determined to enact. Your response?
Well, I mean, I think that's patently untrue. I just don't think the evidence would bear that out. Do you hear about Peter Dutton talking about the, cultural cringe? Do you hear Peter Dutton talking about the empire, the British Empire? No, I mean, these are look. I think politicians should talk more about history, and they should talk about it critically and in a constructive way, of course. But I mean, I'm not sure where that person was coming from, to be honest. I think they maybe they'd read a Donald Horne piece from sort of 50 years ago and thought that was what misdated to 2024.
And I think the broader point here is that analysis is not endorsement. We're here to reflect on the Menzies history. That doesn't mean we're endorsing everything that Menzies did.
No, and I mean, I think that's an important part of our work is we're not into hagiography. We actually deliberately go about finding academics, scholars, public intellectuals to participate in our research, in our public events with a range of views, because we think the debate, the critique, the reflection on a history, whether you loved Menzies or not, recognising what he the impact he had and his governments had on the shaping of modern Australia, and things like what Zach was saying, like home ownership. I mean, what went on in that era when we saw home ownership rates go from 53 to 71%? I mean, that transformed Australia, and there were reasons why they did that. The Menzies government. You can reflect on those policies. You can say some of them have created problems down the track that have sort of commodification of housing as a sort of wealth enhancement vehicle rather than as creating people's homes and a place to raise families. But I mean, all these issues are worth debating and learning about. Just sort of ignoring them because they're some dead old white guy. He was all about them and they're unfashionable these days. We don't want to talk about them.
And he was a creature of his culture.
Yeah.
On economics, many contributors to your book, Zach, talk about the striking contrast between Menzies' rhetoric, particularly in the 1949 election campaign against the Labor Party led by then Prime Minister Ben Chifley, the language of free markets and free enterprise, railing against bank nationalisation that you mentioned. But Menzies also said in 1964, quote, "Where government action or control has seemed to us to be the best answer to a practical problem, we have adopted that answer at the risk of being called socialists." Zach?
Well, I think Menzies was actually, to a certain extent, running away from the label laissez-faire, that this was a label thrown at the centre-right of Australian politics for certainly the late 19th century and into the early 20th century.
Which is stressed laissez-faire is let the hand move freely, let government's hand off the market economy, free enterprise.
And essentially it was associated with social Darwinism, that you would just let the strong survive and thrive and the weak would just be left. And of course, Menzies didn't believe in that. Menzies had this tremendous sense of community. And Menzies was actually, interestingly enough, someone who railed against materialism. One of his main arguments against communism, that it was a godless materialist ideology that thought that utopia on earth was possible, when he wanted to strive for something higher. That's one of the reasons he invests so heavily into Australia's system of university education. He didn't have a sort of utilitarian idea of what the university should be. He wanted people to fall in love with learning for learning's sake.
And at the Menzies Library, I think you have a book, his own personal copy of Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which was published in 1944. The great Austrian economist is one of our heroes here at CIS, but he was hardly a Hayekian. He was more likely to be a Keynesian, correct?
Yeah, he is reading. He's reading both sides, and he reads some of Marx. Even he is one of those great broad thinkers, and it's really great. The reason, among many reasons, why we are where we are at the University of Melbourne is that not only was Menzies a student there, he tutored there just after he graduated. He later came back to be chancellor, but he actually gave over his personal library of over 4,000 books, which is now housed at the Bayou Library, and which forms the core of our museum, is us putting on display Menzies' books and seeing what he's underlined and seeing who's signed it, who's gifted him what. And it really testifies to a breadth of reading. And Menzies is reading from every influence and then making up his own mind. And this is why it came up in my speech and in Greg's speech. You can't put him in a box because he's not just taking as rote learning ideas from other people.
That period, of course, starting in the late 40s, early 50s, right through much of his prime ministership, was a period of prosperity and stability. This is the great post-war prosperity. Paul Keating, Greg, lamented when he was prime minister in the early to mid-1990s that we, meaning Labor, built the post-war structures and we just gave it to the Liberal Party. We just gave it to Menzies. Your response?
I think it's probably more important that Menzies took it. I can see what Keating meant. I mean, right, Menzies was a great pragmatist, and he was not ideological in the sense that if something worked, he'd reject it simply because the other side had come up with it. I mean, he really was quite eclectic in many ways, and I mean, you can see him in different ways. So, I mean, the argument, was he like Deakin, wasn't he not like Deakin? I mean, it's absolutely correct. On the free trade protectionism axis, he was complicated. But as a sort of social energiser, he was much more like Deakin. I mean, you try and think how to describe Deakin, and people will talk about Deakin being a social liberal. I think Deakin was actually much more like a liberal conservative. I mean, he was a complicated mix of a willingness to experiment and engage, just like Menzies. I think that's probably where they were most similar. So I can understand Keating's irritation, and to some extent it's true.
Let's turn to questions. Anyone got any questions for our panel? Jared Henderson. Jared Henderson has written some important books on the Liberal Party history, including Menzies' Child, that was published, I think, in the mid-1990s. Jared.
Thanks, Tom. I'm a great fan of everyone on the panel, but particularly Greg, I guess. I think he exhibits tonight a sort of Irish pessimism of the kind you find in Flann O'Brien, which is sort of everything's bad and will invariably get worse, is the sort of Flann. But I'd just like to say I don't agree with that assessment. If you look back to the 70s, Menzies was loathed by half the Liberal Party. I mean, not Malcolm Fraser, not John Howard, but there were a lot of Liberals in the Billy Snedden mode who did, and Menzies complained about this, and he voted Democratic Labour Party on a couple of occasions. I think he gave his preference to the Liberals, he didn't give his preference to Labour. And through the 80s, Menzies was looked down on. And there's been a great revival of Menzies in the last 30 years. And it's exhibited in the Menzies Institute in Melbourne and in the Menzies Centre here, but also in a number of books. So you go look at the books. Huh? And of course, John Howard's book, very important. But you go back and look at what was written in universities about Menzies in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and Menzies now looks a giant in Australian history compared with that, and Everett's gone the other way. Everett was the great giant at universities in the 60s and 70s, and all the Everett memorial lectures have just become memorials and the lectures have ceased. So I think Greg's been a bit too pessimistic on that.
Yeah, well, in his letters to Heather Henderson that were published a few years ago by Heather Henderson, his daughter, Menzies, in that period in the 1970s that you mentioned, Gerard, these were private letters, he never said this publicly. He said that John Gorton, who was Prime Minister from 68 to 71, was, quote, very seldom does his homework and is therefore inclined to form a quick and ill-informed judgment. And on Billy McMahon, he calls him an untrustworthy little scamp. Billy Snedden, whom you mentioned, the Liberal leader from 74 to 75, he was, among other things, politically an idiot. He always says the wrong thing at the wrong time. And here's one. February 1968, this is fascinating. I know this is not the period we're talking about. Menzies watched the Test cricket at the MCG with his arch rival Arthur Calwell, who faced him in 61, 63. And of course, then he faced Harold Holt in 66. He said 90% of the time, Calwell devoted his opinion of Gough Whitlam, which, needless to say, coincides with mine.
I should defend myself against being an Irish pessimist. I'm actually an Irish catastrophist. I'm way beyond that. And probably my view on this has been formed by having spent most of my life in academia. So, if you're trying to be a liberal conservative anywhere, at any university, I mean, I was reflecting on this the other day, I don't think I would even have been hired at any point in the last 15
Greg
years.
Miller-Hewish at the University of Wollongong.
Yeah, I think he was there for 30 years before they finally made him a full professor, only recently. But
That's interesting.
Tom,
Georgina,
if you don't mind, I on the Keating criticism of Menzies, I was reflecting on how the 1950s, we're in post-war period. Australia's been through, the 1940s, terrible instability, insecurity, fear, and deprivations through rationing, and Menzies got in, and yes, he did continue the massive immigration program that Chifley had started. The Snowy Hydro he continued with. He got ANZUS done, but certainly the start of that relationship was building through Curtin's time as Prime Minister. But what is often a criticism of Menzies is that the 1950s were nothing really happened. It was a really, really boring time in Australia. And I I really think it's an important part of our work to make the case for the good times, the stable times. And they don't make good history books, sadly. But the people of Australia were yearning for just getting on with their lives, to raise their families, to buy a house, to get a job. The economic conditions were fantastic then, and it was the golden era of economic growth. Unemployment was so low in South Australia one year that there were only 3 people registered as being unemployed. But I mean, Keating criticises that, but actually, wouldn't that be wonderful?
Well, I mean, also following on from that, there is a widespread view among historians, not unreasonably, that this period we're talking about, the early to mid-50s, was a period of bipartisanship because Menzies kept in place a lot of the Chifley Curtin economic structures. But on one key issue, there was not bipartisanship, and that was on trade in 57. It was the Menzies government that strongly supported the Commerce Trade Agreement with Japan, and Labor strongly opposed it, correct? Zach?
Yeah, not only that, that Menzies had laid the groundwork for that in 51 in far more controversial circumstances when he signs on to the Treaty of San Francisco, which is essentially a soft peace treaty for Japan that's going to repeat none of the mistakes of Versailles. It's not going to have massive reparations. It's actually going to allow Japan to rebuild and become an essential Cold War ally, because the whole point was the Americans were pushing this soft peace treaty because they thought that if you impoverish Japan, then Japan might fall to communism, because communism it feeds on poverty. Communism doesn't get a foot in the door outside of university campuses when you've got prosperity. So Menzies shows incredible bravery in 1951, and the speeches in that from Hansard in that debate, one of which is from your grandfather, who was in
Alexander Downer Sr.
in a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Yes,
And these are people who less than a decade ago went through that, and they're advocating for this. It's
I remember once meeting Caspar Weinberger, who was the defense secretary under President Reagan. We met in 96, and he caught the Australian accent. He said, the thing I like about Australians is the extent to which your government went to great lengths and was supported by the people in reaching out to Japan so soon, relatively soon after the war. And I thought about that. I thought that's a lot to be said, because Japan treated Australians pretty terribly, those, to put it mildly and politely. But it was a real sea change, and Menzies led the effort for that Commerce Trade Agreement with, I suspect, John McEwen, who was the leader of the Country Party.
Yeah,
correct?
McEwen is generally known as the spearhead.
Yeah.
Menzies does, and that comes through in the series, Menzies does give a free hand to a lot.
But all
lot
this
of his
talk
more
that Asia was
talented-
founded by Labor, Evatt dropped the ball on a crucial public policy issue.
I know, and it was Menzies who in 1939 who said, what to you is the Far East is to us the Near North.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Yes, Anne Henderson.
I just want to take up Georgina's comment on Donald Horne. Very relevant. Excellent book written by Ryan Kropp that's just come out, except whenever he mentions Menzies. And everything he says about the Menzies era, the Menzies years, Menzies is pure and utter, and there's not much of it in the book. And the book is an excellently researched study of Donald Horne and his ideas. But it's a classic example of how the left have won the debate on this subject of what happened in the Menzies years and how Whitlam was the great advancer of liberation. So I think the main thing that historians have to do is pretty much what you're doing, Georgina, down in Melbourne, and Zach. You have to counter the propaganda that has pretty much gone right through the universities and schools for the last 40 years, 50 years. And as Jared said, it begins with the adulation of people like Evatt, who's now faded, and it's been changed by the restoration of people's attitude in writing about the Menzies years. And I think this is what you've got to do. You've got to go to the things that are weak, whether it's Judith Brett or Ryan Kropp or wherever, and you have to demonstrate that they're just pumping left-wing propaganda. So good on you.
Well, we've had both Ryan and Judith on our podcast, and Judith was a contributor to our first book, and which just shows we are interested in the different points of view.
And her book on the moral middle class wasn't without merit, correct? Really? Okay, well, opinion might differ. Next question. Okay. But it's wonderful things about history. There's always different schools of thought. Andrew Robb, who was a great trade minister in the Abbott-Turnbull era. And Andrew, I hope you appreciated that point about Menzies and the Commerce Trade Agreement in 1957. Great to see you, mate.
Thanks very much. No, I was long seized with the importance of that. And my father spent 3 years in PNG, driving trucks, taking supplies out to our front line, and his truck got bombed, and so he had a difficult 3 years against the Japanese. And I'd always been interested that he got a bit tetchy about Japanese cars, but basically, I mean, I'm one of 9 kids. He never put down the Japanese to us, and it was an interesting, you know. I thought about this quite. I've never talked to him about it, but I observed it.
And if you fast forward to 2024, there's a front page story today in the Australian where the former Japanese ambassador to Australia,
Yes,
Shingo, forgot his last name, but Yabagami, he makes it clear that Japan should be part of AUKUS.
yes.
Who would have thought
Yeah,
after
yes.
all those years?
No, it's amazing,
Isn't it?
amazing.
Sorry, Andrew.
No, look, firstly, I want to say it's been, the contributions tonight have been first class. Thank you all. Zach, you've done a great job. Appreciate it. Georgina, as others have said, the centre the institute is really important, I think, for all the reasons. I won't repeat any of it, but you've done a great job in the time you've taken charge. And Tom, I really appreciate CIS, which for a long time, I've admired what you guys do for so long. I've spoken a few times over the years, and but to provide a platform, because at the moment it's Melbourne principally based, and that's a frustration when you're in Sydney and I see all the speakers and things that you get there. But to get the support you've got is really
An
critical.
event on Bill McMahon.
Yes.
We launched the biography of
There you
Bill
go.
McMahon a few years ago, so we're pretty broad range here at CIS.
But finally, it's probably covered coming in the other chapters, but I felt that the Menzies decision on funding private schools, particularly Catholics, one, as a politician, it must have been such a wonderful wedge issue. Like, I just would have loved to have been around when the Labor Party's trying to deal with this issue, right?
Because Labor was overwhelmingly Labor and Catholic in those days, and Liberals were more Protestant, weren't they?
Well, my parents were DLP. I remember Dad handing out how to vote cards at 14 for the DLP, and they went from being traditionally Labor to but the communist, especially in Victoria and southern Queensland, not so much here, but very much in Victoria, this big movement of Catholics into the DLP. And then as the DLP is diminishing in the early 70s, there's Whitlam, and they couldn't handle the social the social emphasis, the liberal emphasis that he had on social issues. They wanted the conservative on social issues, and that's where they moved, en masse, many of them, to the Liberal Party, and that's where the tradies, that's where all that's grown out of. It's a fascinating study over time how all these things have played a part. But I just wanted to put the comment that I think that was a really major, as
Andrew,
I say,
thank
it's
you
probably
for raising
coming
it.
out
We'll get
later.
Greg.
Yeah.
Greg, of course, was Vice Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University.
Of course.
Your feedback.
Great
and
job
a
too.
Victorian. As a Victorian Catholic, I think you're absolutely right. People talk about the private school, Catholic school funding as having shattered the Labor Party politically, and I think that's true. What they don't realise is I think it shattered the Labor Party psychologically because of the massive migration of those Catholics psychologically and philosophically across the divide. I mean, as I say, having a father who could still say he was a democratic socialist, faithfully voting for Menzies on exactly those issues. I always remember Jeff Kennett, in possibly his only moment of historical reflection, saying to me when I was Crown Counsel, Greg, If it hadn't been for what Labor did to you bastards during the split, we could never have formed a government, because half my cabinet are Victorian Catholics and most of my key advisors. So the long-term effect of that was appalling.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Does anyone want to ask a question? Jared, just make sure, does anyone have a question? No? Right? Okay, Jared, yep, go for just wait for the mic, mate.
Just following up on Georgina's comment, I think it's an absolute mythology that the 50s in Australia were boring. I lived through them as a young person. Howard Jacobson, who the Jewish British writer, spent time at Sydney University in the 50s and the 60s, but also something he looked back to the 50s. He was interviewed on an ABC program not so long ago, and he said that the 50s in Australia were vibrant. There was a strong cultural movement. The arts began to thrive. It's just sort of anti-Menzies left-wing propaganda to describe it that way, because people want to come and live here. Not many people exited the place. It was people turning in. And if you look across the arts, what was going on here, I mean, it was lively compared with anywhere else. And for a small country,
of course, we had in Melbourne in 1956 the Olympics, which would have had a
Olympics.
huge impact on the nation's.
And not only that, the Queen turned up and Elizabeth Taylor rocked up. So can't have been too bad.
Paul Espy, yeah. Paul Espy, of course, is a former chairman of the Menzies Research Institute and played an instrumental role in putting forward Menzies' name as a major figure in Australian history.
I'm not sure whether this is an appropriate question to throw out to the audience, but I'll try. And it's a marketing question. Listening to Zach describing Menzies, the thing that stood out to me and probably most of the people in the room is that there's a difference between the image of Menzies as an arch, shall I characterise it as an arch conservative, essentially. In modern idiom, that's the sort of image that you would describe, I think, under Menzies. And so the challenge for think tanks today, and I worry about this myself, because I say to the people that listen to me in the discourse, you've got to get your facts straight. And it's all very well to get your facts straight, but there's an image thing. There's a reference thing to what people are thinking about what your facts and principles actually are. So if you're into liberal conservatism, which our think tanks, I think, can be described as doing, and our arch image figure, Menzies, has got an antiquated conservative aura around him. I think that's a fair description. But if you listen to what Zach's got to say, and Zach's done his homework, and he describes somebody who came from humble background in Japarat, and we all know the history, and he became an intellectual, philosophical, and political giant. Back to my opening comment, there's a marketing image. There's a marketing issue here. If we care about getting this straight in the public eye and public idiom, what should the think tanks be doing other than just writing his history about Menzies and what he did? Because the history is not enough on its own.
I can think of one thing. So, I mean, Georgina says, there are, how many people doing Australian history in Victoria?
500.6%.
Okay, so 500, and probably 470 of them are being taught the wrong thing. I actually think Conservative governments have had one real opportunity where they could have done something, and they've monumentally failed, and that was in civics education. So if you could actually command a decent program of civics education, which by definition would include history, and if you could command it from the sort of the commanding slopes of conservatism, without propagandising the thing, you could do an enormous amount of good. And yet historically, I think the last time Conservatives tried to do that was under David Kemp in the mid-90s. And I know that because Yeah, I was actually on the group, and that group included people like John Hurst and Stuart McIntyre. And yet it still managed to prescribe civics readers, which sent the cultural left into hysterics. Now, I don't think since then there's been that sort of serious attempt, even though there have been plenty of conservative governments with plenty of conservative money that could have done it. Now, it's very hard for a think tank to persuade 90% of 15-year-olds in Australia. When I taught constitutional and legal history at universities, I used to start with a lecture which was a quiz. And I'd say, who was Lachlan Macquarie? And a group of 100 kids, there would be 4 who would know. Now, interestingly, no one who knew who Ben Chifley was. So none in 5 years of teaching that subject. So I always wonder about that lost opportunity.
Okay, well, that sounds like an appropriate way to conclude this evening's festivities. Can I just ask all of you just to thank Greg Craven, Zach Gorman and Georgina Downer. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.